We'd like to thank our sponsors, Hack and Rose, Attorneys at Law, New York City. New Pathway Counseling Services, Pine Brook, New Jersey. Warren Sand Company, Springfield, Illinois. Shook Funeral Home, Clifton, New Jersey. MEDSCREEN Laboratories, Clifton, New Jersey. Standard Tile of East Hanover. HAYEK'S Hometown Market in Newton, New Jersey. And thanks to the many other sponsors listed here.
Hi everybody, I'm Bob Kosh of Greater Good Media LLC. I'd like to welcome you to episode 2 of Breaking the Silence. And we'd also like to thank the Kiwanis Club for allowing us to get this presentation out to you. Once again, it's all about protecting our community's children. Before I send this over to Clark, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in last week for episode 1. We've been tracking the numbers online and the viewership is way up. We hope what we're bringing you is informative and has value. With that said, I want to turn this over to Clark Fredericks.
Thank you, Bob. Good evening, everyone. Last week, our first episode, we covered the grooming process. I had retired Lieutenant Howie Ryan come on. And we went through the 6 stages of the grooming process. And that episode was an attempt to prevent abuse from happening, to make people aware. This week's episode is on if the horror of abuse has occurred, the treatment that occurs afterwards. I'm going to have 2 people on from Ginnie's house who deal with children firsthand who have been abused. They get them to open up and recount the horrors and the pain they have experienced. For those of you who don't know my story, I was molested and raped from ages 7 to 12 by my Boy Scout leader. At age 7, after I just had open heart surgery, he did his first physical contact with me by rubbing his fingers up and down my open heart surgery scar. From there, it progressed to him showing me pornography, to him plying me with alcohol at age 9 onwards. The physical contact went on to wrestling matches, and at age 12, he raped me. I lived in silence for over 30 years after I was raped. I think one of the problems with people who have been abused, children who have been abused, their refusal to talk about it, is that it's someone they know and trust. If I had gotten pulled down under a bridge by a vagrant and molested, I would have went running home screaming bloody murder to my parents. But because it was someone I looked up to, someone I trusted, someone I couldn't believe would harm me, it totally twisted my thinking. It destroyed my trust, destroyed my thought process, and it led me into silence. To ensure my silence, my abuser abused animals in front of me and told me the same thing would happen to me if I spoke about the abuse. I was locked in silence for over 30 years until I ran into my abuser again. And by his side, he had another young boy. And that young boy was calling him the same nickname he had insisted I call him when I was that young boy's age. I went into a panic attack that day. I ran out of the deli I was in, where I saw them at, and my life crumbled apart. My pain was reopened. I walked out of the family-owned business I was in for over 16 years, and I dove headfirst into drugs and alcohol, not caring if I lived or died. I was living that way for months, abusing pain pills, heroin, cocaine, alcohol. When I drove to my abuser's home, the same home he had raped me in, and I confronted him, a violent struggle ensued, and I stabbed him to death. I faced life in prison, and I was blessed to only receive a 5-year sentence. Since then, I've become an advocate to bring awareness to people. I played a part in changing the law in New Jersey, the statute of limitations law. And now I'm doing this 5-part series to shine light into the dark that nobody wants to talk about. My guests this week are from Ginnie's house in Newton, New Jersey. As I said, they deal with abused children. My first guest is the executive director, Kristi Young. Welcome, Kristi.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here.
Sure. Why don't you, Kristi, give a brief overview of what Ginnie's house does to treat children?
Okay, so Ginnie's house is a children's advocacy center. It's a child-friendly and child-focused environment where a child who has disclosed abuse can come and tell their story, hopefully one time, to all of the people that might be involved in the child welfare system. So they would come to Ginnie's house where they would meet with a plainclothes detective who would do a recorded forensic interview, which would be used hopefully in court and could also be passed on to the DCP&P workers, which is the child welfare agency in New Jersey.
You try to do the interview in a safe environment so they don't have to go to court to testify?
In theory, that would be great if they didn't have to. In New Jersey, someone who's accused of a crime has the right to face their accuser. So oftentimes the child still does have to testify. But oftentimes it's used to maybe try to get a plea, say this is the interview that the child has given us. But it's really a way of trying to reduce the re-traumatization that a child is going to go through having to tell their story over and over and over again. Before CACs existed, a child who disclosed abuse would have to go to the police department, which can be very scary for a child, and talk to a police officer, then maybe a detective, then maybe a state trooper, then maybe a detective at the prosecutor's office, then an attorney, then a judge, then a counselor. So Ginnie's house and other children's advocacy centers were built to provide a coordinated response to those allegations, and keep the child front and center and the focus of what we do.
Do parents bring their child directly to you, or is this all through the legal system, or
both? It can be both. We can have children come to us from any variety of ways. The parent may call, and it could be a self-referral. Maybe something has happened. It doesn't quite rise to the level of DCP&P being involved, but there was some kind of trauma and the child needs therapy. So they can come to us that way, or they can come to us through the system.
What
so
if
somebody
they don't have insurance?
That's okay. Ginnie's house provides trauma-focused therapy for children free of charge.
Awesome.
So,
you and I spoke briefly beforehand, and there was a statistic you told me about July.
yes.
Could you share that statistic with our audience?
Sure.
And why that stat is so high?
Sure.
Because I've seen countless articles
Right.
about what you're going to talk about online. I've seen people post about it, and you're here to say it's really happening.
Right.
So
Sure. So I was just recently kind of putting our statistics together, and with this pandemic going on, we've noticed that the hotline is eerily quiet. People are not calling to report any kind of abuse. Children are now cut off from possibly safe adults that they would normally turn to. Teachers, other family members, neighbors, friends. And in that isolation, children are possibly being abused, but nobody's reporting it.
Right.
And so the phones were kind of silent for months. Now that things have kind of started to reopen, we've noticed that there's been an influx of calls. So I was just looking at our numbers, and our stats for this July were up 260%.
260%.
260
from previous July.
from the last 3 Julys.
Wow.
Yes. So
I've seen articles that the increase of abuse is skyrocketing because kids are stuck at home,
right.
and you're here to confirm that is happening.
Yes. I mean, vulnerable families probably are experiencing even more uncertainty during this time. They might be facing financial crises. Drug and alcohol use has gone up. So kids that were already vulnerable are even more vulnerable now.
Who do you see as the abuser of children? Is it more family member oriented, or is it? Obviously, I'm going to assume from all the articles I've read that it's someone they know. Like, it's always over 90%.
Yes.
A person they know and trust.
Yes.
That's true with you guys.
Yes, for sure. It's 90% people that the child already knows and trusts. However, we have seen an increase in child-on-child offending.
Yeah.
So it's about 25% of our cases actually are children who are underage that are offending on other children.
Wow.
So
Are you finding that children that come to you for abuse then become an abuser on another child?
Yes. So as part of my role as the director of Ginnie's House, I'm the MDT coordinator, which is a multidisciplinary team. When I was kind of saying that we take a team approach to child abuse, and what we do is we review cases that come. And the people that sit at the table that are part of this team are prosecutors, detectives, law enforcement, mental health counselors, DCPMP, all of the people that might be involved with these children. When we do these reviews, I put the agenda together with the child's name on it. And we've noticed recently, especially, several of the children that are on our agenda are on as a victim and are also now on as an offender.
Wow.
So it is an unfortunate statistic that children
Is it because they didn't get enough treatment? Did the parents bring them and then stop and then?
There's no way of knowing necessarily from where I'm sitting what the rationale is, what the reasoning is. But there are programs available for children who are offending. So there's a program in New Jersey, it's called Problematic Sexualized Behavior Treatment. And it's for children who are between the ages of 9 and 12 who have problematic sexualized behaviors. The problem that we're seeing is that it's a voluntary program. And oftentimes parents don't want to admit that their child is offending and don't want to seek that therapy because they're afraid of the stigma attached to it.
There's
Yes.
stigma attached all along
Sure.
child abuse.
Yep.
In my case, when I was going through my criminal case, they uncovered a fellow Boy Scout who was abused by the same guy, who the mother brought to the state police one day to file charges. The father came the next day to take the charges away because he didn't want his son being labeled gay over this.
Right.
So there's stigma all along this road
Absolutely.
of childhood abuse.
Absolutely. And, the problem that we see is that children, physical abuse and sexual abuse and neglect are part of what's called ACEs. What is the word? ACEs, I'm sorry. Adverse childhood experiences. So studies have shown that the more ACEs a child may have, could be abuse, it could be losing their home, it could be a divorce, it could be the loss of a loved one. Studies show that the more ACEs that an adult had as a child, it predisposes them to mental health issues. So in short, without intervention, this is going to cause lifelong trauma.
When I was in prison, I got therapy for the first time. And my therapist, I mentioned this last week, my therapist told me that the unit I was on 1 out of 3, closer to 2 out of 3 guys on my unit were there for a sex crime.
Yeah.
And she didn't want me, having the other inmates, knowing that I murdered my sexual predator and go try to get me to do something stupid to one of these guys. And I said, that's not going to happen. And I wanted to know why these guys were locked up, what they did for them in prison. And now, this is a very liberal position to be a social worker in prison. And I thought she would have this bleeding heart answer for me. And she looks me in the eye and says nothing. She goes, they're master manipulators, they're liars, they don't want help, and there's nothing we can do for them. So I think you have to reach them at that young age to correct this behavior before they get down the road and it's over with.
Yes, definitely. You kind of talk about in your story how, you were kind of treating all of these peripheral things and never getting to the heart of what was really wrong. Right. It's like we treat the smoke, but we don't treat the fire.
Right.
And so you have to get to the heart of what the problem is. As early as possible for the best outcome.
And my therapist in prison, that's one of the things she asked me, and I had to think about it just for a second. She said, I led a life off the charts, gambling addiction, drug addiction, sexual addiction. I just went, my mind told me sleeping with enough women would heal all these insecurities I had. It didn't work. And my therapist said, throughout your 20s and 30s, when you were living that lifestyle, did you equate what happened to you as a child to the way you're living? And I thought for a second, I'm like, no, I'm just living this off the charts life, running full throttle constantly, but not equating it to that, and that's what you just brought up.
And the thing is, recurring trauma in childhood, it rewires the brain. But the good news is we know how to treat trauma.
Awesome.
And so if we can get to these children as early as possible, the better the outcome is going to be. And kids are resilient. And that's the best thing about our jobs. People always ask, how do you do this? How do you do this job every day? It's because these kids they're so resilient. There's hope there. We just have to get to them early.
Right. The topic of this 5-part series is breaking the silence.
Yes.
And you and Alexandra are doing that, and it fits in perfect to this. And I want to thank you for what you do. I thank you for Ginnie's house. And I want to get into specifics on the treatment, and I think Alexandra can handle that better.
Yep.
So I just want to say thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you for sharing your story with everybody. I feel like, by you sharing your story, it gives permission to other people to share their stories.
Yeah, I get contacted nonstop by people who are emboldened after hearing me speak out about it.
Sure.
And silence is what destroyed my life.
Yes.
And the secrets were like a toxin that just grew in me, and it took on a life of its own. And you can't bury something like that.
Yeah.
You can for a while, and you can use things in your external world to cover it over. It'll only work for so long.
Yeah.
And you have to heal the inside at some point in time. It was almost too late for me. If I had gotten a life in prison sentence, my abuser would have had control of me from age 7 all the way to the grave. And that is just unacceptable. And that's what I try to tell people who reach out to me. I'm like, you have to break the silence. Do not allow your abuser to get decades of your life from you after the abuse has happened.
Right.
It's just unacceptable.
Yes.
So I want to thank you for being here. Thank you, Kristi.
Thank you.
My next guest is on the board of Ginnie's house, and she's a psychologist. She deals with children directly, and I want to hear from her exactly how she breaks that wall of silence. I'm honored to invite Alexandra Miller. Thank you, Dr. Miller.
It's a privilege to be here. Thank
Thanks.
you, Clark.
Yes. When I was young, immediately after my rape, my abuser dropped me off at the lake community down at the dam where he would troll for us young boys who were always playing down there. And he dropped me and my bike off there. And I didn't want to be by the dam area after just getting raped because I didn't want to see the other boys. I didn't want to see anybody. So I ran down the river with my bike. I ditched my bike in the weeds and I ran down the river and I just was rocking back and forth along the river by myself, trying to comprehend what had just happened to me. And my mind, to protect me, thought it was helping me, but it was actually doing more damage. My mind said, we do not want to talk about what just happened, because that'll be reliving it, and we certainly don't want to relive what happened. We can just bury this and go about our life. This is a little 12-year-old mind coming up with that within an hour of being raped.
Yeah.
Have you faced that mindset in children that you deal with?
In children and in adults.
In adults also.
One term that's used to describe that is called experiential avoidance. And that's anything that we do to avoid pain that otherwise, and that's the parent that comes home and drinks. And it might feel like a temporary relief from the pain, but it's only temporary. It keeps them from doing things that matter most to them, right? And it sounds like that's what you were doing for a while with a number of different addictions.
Yeah, almost immediately, I got raped in between the summer where 6th grade ended at the elementary school and 7th grade began at the high school.
Yeah.
And it was in those summer months. And the thought when I was in 6th grade at Stillwater Elementary School of doing any type of drug was so far outside my realm of thinking. It was an impossibility. And yet, I endure this extreme trauma.
Yeah.
And I have no coping skills. And my mind tells me we're not going to talk about it.
Right.
So now I'm stuck with this pain.
Big secret and this pain.
Right. So within months of being abused, I start smoking marijuana on a weekly basis. Do you see that in other children? Is that
certainly? Doesn't that make sense? That it's a way to escape, not knowing other ways to escape, and you go into la la land and you don't have to feel.
Right.
So to actually do the work, and when I do have someone in the room with me doing this work, I tell them, you're going to have to feel things in order to heal. You're going to have to hurt. You're
All
going
right,
to
so
have
a
to tell
10-year-old
story.
comes to you. They've been traumatized like I was.
Yeah.
And that, you'll tell them.
Well,
Look,
the first thing is to...
take me through how you break down that wall.
Okay, the wall begins before. First, I have to make myself a safe place for them. And I want to mention that having a safe adult in a child's world is one of the protective factors to children that experience trauma. Another protective factor is children that can actually enjoy things, like sports and different activities. So first, I need for the child to feel safe with me, and that means establishing a rapport in the therapeutic setting. And it might mean talking about other things to take care of their world and make their world a better place, like looking at their sleep, letting them talk about their friendships, looking at their nutrition, looking at things, other stuff, before we start talking about why it is that they're there. And once it becomes time...
How many sessions does it take before they'll even start talking to you? Or is it each kid different?
It's individual. Sometimes, it depends on the age. Some teenagers they just can't wait to get treatment and talk about it. Yeah.
Awesome.
So the safe place doesn't have to be a psychologist. It might end up being a teacher or a minister, and that's why Ginnie's house actually will educate the secret keepers which are many of us, right? On what do you do when a child approaches you, or when an adult, or when there's an allegation of sexual abuse. How do you handle it? And one of the things we talk about, it's called the yuck factor.
The yuck factor. What is the yuck factor?
The yuck factor is reasons that people don't want to report child abuse. For example, a minister who has a family who's been very supportive of the church, and then there's an allegation that that father is an abuser. Do they want to report it to Child Protective Services and cause a whole ruckus in the church? That's the yuck factor. Those are those feelings like, ugh, you know. And then there are people that have perceptions about Child Protective Services, which is called DCP&P in New Jersey, and they're like, no, they're not going to help. They're going to take the child away. But I always tell people, don't be afraid of them. They are there to help, and that's a first step. But when they come in, okay, so let's say you have the child in the office who I have now explained about something called exposure therapy, where they tell their story, okay? Telling the story in a certain way is going to move the trauma. If you can imagine that hidden secret is in one place of their brain, talking about it with me in a relaxed setting will move it to a different part of the brain. Not technically, but that's how I explain it to them. And it will never be the same again. Because just imagine from a neural network perspective, meaning our brain cells that are like trees, they were there alone with the trauma. When they talk about it, it's now mixed in with me and the office. They're attached. And it will never be quite the same again. And it'll make it easier. So the first time is the hardest time to talk about it.
Right.
And then if they do it again, they notice that it's easier and easier.
My first time was to my defense attorney in the county jail.
Yeah.
He's the very first one I opened up to, and I bawled like a little baby as I spoke about what happened.
Yeah.
And the second person I opened up to was our criminal defense psychologist we hired to do a report on me. And the same thing is, I bawled to her. The third time I spoke about my abuse was in court, surrounded by cameras and news people and my family, and who had never heard anything. And if you go on YouTube, you know, there's a 15-minute video of me reading my allocution statement, it's called. And it was excruciating to get out. But after those 3 instances, the next time I spoke about it was to my therapist in prison. And by the time I spoke to her in prison, there was no crying at all. There was no problem talking about it. I got into the group therapy. There was no problem talking about it in group therapy. And that's what I try to get across to people. It'll get easier every time you talk about it.
That's right.
And that's exactly what you're saying.
It does get easier every time. And then it extends to other things like cues or places that you might have avoided, right? Then you're able to start to face those things to lead to a more normal life again, so that you can not just have a normal life, hopefully, but flourish. And here you are in front of the cameras, able to talk about it. And I'm sure it might be still a little hard, but
it's also healing every time I do it.
yeah.
You know, I tell people I can't sit home on my couch and say I'm healed and not help the next person find their voice. You know, so you are helping people find their voice. I try to do that just by sharing my story.
Yes, and there's a beautiful saying by Rabbi Kotzker Rebbe. It's Kotzker Rebbe is what he's called. And he says, there's nothing so whole as a broken heart. And it's the concept that we are a vessel, and once the vessel is broken, the light can come out. So sometimes our brokenness makes us better able to let the light out, and that's what you're doing. You're sharing your brokenness, and it applies to so many things.
Right. I would love to tell you that throughout my life I was empathetic and compassionate, but I wasn't. I was just trying to keep myself from either committing suicide or from killing myself any number of ways through my behavior.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was completely broken and stopped resisting change that then, as you say, the light was able to flourish within me.
What do you mean stop resisting change? Oh, to stop the lifestyle?
I think there's a lot of people who can go through life hovering an inch above bottom, and they can live that way. Whether it's alcoholism, drug addiction, cheating on their spouse, unhappy with work, whatever it is, you're not filled with joy every day. You're not beaming light to the world. You're just hovering an inch above bottom. And for many of us, you have to smack bottom to awaken the inside. And that's what happened to me.
I think you're right about that. Sometimes people do, and that's why AA talks about hitting rock bottom. Carl Jung, psychologist, talked about how you can change very, very slowly through psychotherapy, right? A little faster now because we have a lot of science behind it for all of these years and evidence-based treatments. You can change through religious experiences, he said, and I add you can change through rock bottom experiences, because rock bottom experiences, I think, can be very freeing, because where are you going to go from there?
That's what I tell people.
It's like freeing for people.
I speak at a lot of rehabs, and I'll tell them, you guys should be filled with optimism. And they're all down and out, their shoulders are slumped over, and they're looking at me like cross-eyed when I say that. I go, the only place to go is straight up. You're at rock bottom, Let's rock and roll, let's get it going.
I know.
Let me share how my father initially confronted me. And then, do you deal with parents, as well as a child, how they should communicate with their child?
Parents are very important.
Okay.
The system, that's what I call it.
All right.
Yeah.
My father heard rumors about my abuser. He worked as a sheriff's officer at the county jail, and he was abusing inmates at the jail. And the rumors swirled around our little town of Stillwater. And my father sat me down one day after school. He said, come sit. And he was bemoaning, because we had taken this guy in, who was my abuser, as like a family member.
Yeah.
He, was over for the holidays. He hunted on our land.
Yeah.
He had a serious car crash where he was seriously injured, and my mother insisted he recuperate at our house so she could bathe him and feed him and mend him back to health. That's how we took him in. All the while, he's just looking at me as a victim.
Terrible.
Yeah. And so my father is bemoaning, I can't believe what I'm hearing about Dennis. I can't believe it. I can't believe the rumors that are swirling around our town. So he's putting all this pressure on me now to corroborate this. He goes, son, look at me. Did Dennis ever touch you? And after he just bemoaned this great guy, I can't believe that this great guy is accused of this. And I said, no, Dad, he never touched me. And that was my biggest regret in life.
Hang on, do you still mean that?
That was my biggest regret?
Right now, because that's really hard on yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I could have began healing immediately. Look, my life makes for a great book, but in a lot of ways it was wasted. I sabotaged jobs, I sabotaged romances. I went off the charts from drugs, alcohol, gambling, women, etc. I could have began
So
healing.
you feel like
Looking
you
back,
lost time.
I lost a lot of time. Yeah.
Okay.
And had I not committed the murder, my lifestyle probably would have took me to the grave. So had I, as that young boy when my father sat me down, could he have worded it differently that would have made it more easy for me to
You
open up?
already know the answer to that, right?
Let's hear from
Yeah.
the psychologist to tell the people
Yeah.
whose parents are out there.
Let me tell you, now here's someone who was safe, who the family loved.
Right.
They loved him, they adored him. And before I answer that, I want you to know that I had an experience with a nanny who was abusive to myself and my brother. We lived in Rio de Janeiro for 2 years. I have a Brazilian mother. So I'm around 7 years old, and she was very, very mean, and she physically hurt us. And I was too afraid to tell my mom because I was terrified she would hurt us further, just like the animals with yours.
Right.
And one day, my aunt noticed something, and this woman often did, in Portuguese, there's a word called beliscão. It's a huge pinch and a twist. Pinch your arm and twist, beliscão. Well, she did that all the time. My aunt saw it. So she pulls me into a room with my mother and says, "Is Alana hurting you?" And I thought, wow, this is my chance, right? And then I looked and I saw a little crack of a door and I saw her eyes.
Oh.
And she was there. Now that's not someone, I think Dennis was closer to your family than this woman was. And yet, I still didn't tell on her because I was a child. And this is an authority figure and you're afraid. Now, the mistake my mother made is that she didn't ask follow-up questions.
Right.
And she didn't ask again later. She didn't ask again. She dropped it.
Right.
Yeah.
My father did ask me again.
Okay.
And my father talked to a mother of a classmate of mine who was a waitress at a diner in our town. And she told my father over a cup of coffee how her son, who's a classmate, same age, same grade, was raped by my abuser. And my father came home, sat me down again, told me the story about my classmate, and said, "Son, before you answer my question, I want you to know you will never have to go to the police. You will never have to testify in court. I will take care of Dennis myself." So in my mind, my father's telling me he'll go kill Dennis. That's how I took it. So now, the first time was bemoaning that this great guy,
Yeah.
rumors are swirling about this. And so I got all the pressure. Now I got the pressure of being responsible for my father to go commit murder.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I just said, "No, Daddy's never touched me." Same response as first time. So, do parents come in who are so filled with rage that that's their mindset? Do you
Well-
have to do therapy with the parents as well as the child?
Oh, definitely. I always do.
You do.
It's a requirement.
It is.
The parents must participate if I'm working with a teenager or an adolescent or a child.
Participate
In the
with
therapy.
them
They
or
come
separate?
They come into the first session just so I can get a deep background of family history, because there are a lot of family patterns that pass from generation to generation, right? Including trauma. And the second session, we do something called a family sculpture, which is a very creative technique. It's sort of like charades. And they each have to answer the question, what does it feel like to be in this family? And they move each other around the room to show closeness and distance and communication patterns. they might put someone out of the room, they might put the youngest child in the middle and everyone has to go like this. But there's so much, and especially with trauma, that we hold in our bodies that we can't necessarily express with words. But once you express it in your body, maybe, let's say you put the father all the way in the corner and everyone else is here. That says a lot, right? There are tears and people break down. Otherwise there would have been silence, but when they see it like that, when they feel it with their bodies, they break down, and that's healing.
Do you find, I know from people who have reached out to me, I can go on their Facebook page and see if they're, a liberal or a conservative, whether they're male or female. They reach out with that rage that's still in them about wanting to harm their abuser.
Yeah.
Do you get that with the children that come in, with the people you treat, with the parents? Is that rage in the majority of them?
Rage is massive.
Massive.
Yeah.
In the parents as well as the victim?
Yes.
Right. So they have what my father had.
What I'm thinking about right now, and by the way, the rage can also be at the accusation, at being turned into DCP&P, at accusations. There are multiple levels of this. Like, how dare they accuse my friend's son and create this problem, right?
Right.
There's that first. So let's remember, first you have to get the child help by calling Child Protective Services or Ginnie's house, which offers a safe environment. Or it doesn't have to be Ginnie's house, any child advocacy center, which has a child-friendly environment for the interview. But given that, once they feel safe enough to actually tell someone and then get the help, now you're starting the treatment phase. Now the anger, what I'm thinking about right now with you is actually some very, very new research on prisoners and teaching them forgiveness of their perpetrator. And that doesn't mean condoning it, but it means releasing themselves of the anger and the resentment, which then causes violent crimes. And this is work by Dr. Robert Enright and Dr. Maria Gambaro on prisoners. It's fascinating stuff.
So, you're trying to help a child before they become a prisoner,
Yeah.
like myself.
Yeah.
So, part of your therapy is to get them to release that rage and anger.
Well, the exposure therapy is the key. And what that means is the telling of the story. So first you make them safe with you, then you begin a narrative or the exposure therapy where they tell the story within the safe environment, and by telling the story, they can release it. And it frees them of something which otherwise will turn into anger. Right? It can turn into sadness, into depression, into anger. And there is really interesting work on trauma, and there's a delay factor. So a child can experience trauma, and you notice nothing. 9.2 years later, depression and anxiety emerge.
Right.
It's been shown in rats, and it's been shown in humans. Roughly 9 years later, it comes out. And they try to explain that. What is that? And they think it's almost as if, in layman's terms, something is cooking in the brain for 9 years.
Huh.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah. I've since learned that I suffered from PTSD, as abuse victims do. My PTSD didn't kick in until I was in my 40s, and I just went into a horrible depression. Where just swinging my legs off my bed in the morning was like climbing Mount Everest. And to combat that, since I had zero coping skills throughout my life, I began. One thing my abuse did is it caused me to blow through all my boundaries I set in life. Boundaries became meaningless to me. Drinking before work was a boundary that I wouldn't cross, and yet when I fell into this PTSD, coffee no longer cut it in my coffee mug driving to work. It's now wine.
Yeah.
And it was just boundary after boundary after boundary. But the PTSD for me kicked in my 40s, and that's when I began abusing drugs and alcohol to combat that.
Yeah, that's
So
when you started to
you
escape.
treat the PTSD.
So
also.
yeah, the exposure therapy is what treats the PTSD. And I can see how yours was delayed because you were really anesthetizing yourself for that whole time.
Right.
You were somewhere else and you were just drinking and escaping. And probably any time you weren't doing that, you had to feel it. And once
Right.
you actually felt it, you went into depression.
I tell people that I've had the most exhausting life. Like,
Yeah.
it was, and I think people think, I exaggerate sometimes, but my life was pedal to the metal for my whole life.
Yeah.
Sleep sleep is still very difficult for me. Like, I operate on 5-6 hours a night, that's it. And back when I was doing drugs, I would go week after week for months doing cocaine and not sleeping. My sleep patterns before I was doing the drugs were all messed up.
Yeah.
And it was just, I was constantly running, pedal to the metal. If I slowed down, like sitting and meditating early on in life, that was an impossibility.
Yeah.
Mindfulness, impossibility. Yoga, for all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Being still was just something I couldn't do. It had to be go.
Yeah.
You find that. Even young
Well,
children don't
I'm
go.
glad that you bring that up because children do better with experiences through therapy. So, in other words, not everyone can do mindfulness. Mindfulness, by the way, is a fantastic way to teach people how to cope. And there are ways that you can make it interesting for children, but that helps them to become much more aware of their thoughts. And becoming aware of your thoughts, almost as if your thoughts are a parade, right? Like stopping and seeing, okay, what comes out the picture? And now it's the sound of my own voice. And now it's, I hear the clock, right? Just stopping to be aware of that helps you then to be aware of the thoughts that watch the thoughts.
Right.
And that's what helps you to manage better because your thoughts are just thoughts, right? One of the exercises I have people do to demonstrate that your thoughts are just thoughts and they don't have to control you was not created by me, but was, I believe, created by Stephen Hayes. And it's the walking around the circle exercise. And this is what you do. You tell the person, okay, get up and start walking around a circle. And they start walking around a circle. Okay, now I want you to say, I can't walk around a circle. I can't. I'm not motivated to walk around a circle. Impossible to walk around a circle. Yet they still walk around the circle. And that demonstrates that.
Awesome.
So there are cognitive techniques that are also a necessary part of the treatment in managing thoughts. And children that have experienced trauma have a brain bias of noticing negativity more than regular people. Of course, they're regular people too. But they are more likely to notice negativity, negative faces. And they're less likely to notice what's called contextual cues of safety. So they might be in a room and a situation that's completely safe. They should be fine, right? But then they feel fear. And the fear is just there, and it's not going away. And that makes them behave in funny ways. And that gets them in trouble, and that gets them socially in trouble, and that gets them more emotionally reactive, and that gets them in trouble.
Right. Let me pose one other last thing to you. When I began smoking marijuana immediately after my abuse, we all think I thought I was fooling people throughout my whole life with my behavior. Even at that young age, I thought I was fooling everybody. And yet my parents must have sensed something, and they went through my room and found marijuana pipe, rolling papers, and marijuana. And I come home from school one day And there's these three things as a 7th grader sitting on my bed, and my, my heart just sank, and I was like, oh no. And again, it's a lost opportunity. And I'm not trying to blame my father, but he came in and said, this is not going to happen. I'm not going to go through with you. I had older siblings.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm not going to go through with you what I just went through with them. This ends right now, or else I've already looked up and researched a military school just outside of Philadelphia that you will get sent to instantly. So he, instead of an opportunity to open up a dialogue with me, like son, what the hell, what's going on?
Yeah.
That you're using marijuana. You were just in elementary school a few months ago. Why are you now smoking weed?
Yeah.
Instead of opening up a dialogue, it was, this ends now or you go to military school, end of story. So, of course I tell him what he wants to hear. It'll never happen again, Dad.
So let me guess, then you kept secrets, you withheld, and you kept doing it. And
I was already a secret keeper.
Yeah.
Now, secrets just began.
And this is related to the very beginning of what we were talking about, which is how do parents become safe places for children? And it's not just that conversation that finally happens like, are you getting abused? It happens way before that. Have they been safe places all along for bad news? Being a parent that is
a parent has to be a safe place for bad news.
For bad news. That teaches children to become truth tellers. And I work with children and adults who have become quick liars. They lie about anything you can imagine and unnecessary. And it makes their boyfriends mad, their spouses mad. Like, why'd you lie about that?
Right.
Like, that was so unnecessary.
Right.
Well, it becomes second nature.
Yeah.
And almost every time, the parents, which can often be well-meaning parents, are yelling too much, or in worst cases, they're abusing, or they are alcoholics or drug users that are unpredictable. What's Dad going to do when he comes home? Well, I better keep everything nice. I cannot get him upset about anything. I have to keep everything nice. So they learn to lie to survive.
Right. Lie to survive. Right.
Yes.
So I told my father what he wanted to hear.
Yeah.
I took the stuff he told me, get rid of this stuff. I did. I went down to the lake. I threw it all in the lake. 3 weeks later, I'm getting a new pipe from a guy at school, getting my weed back, and I'm right back at it.
Yeah.
It was just because it was a missed opportunity. I look back on it, and I'm sure parents have that reaction when they come into you. Like, I'm not going to allow my kid to smoke weed.
Yeah.
They're going to a rehab. There's consequences to this behavior. Instead of getting to the root cause.
Right, which could be hiding emotional pain. Now there is a subset of people that have just youthful experimentation. Right? But quite a lot of them are doing it to not feel emotional pain, and that's why prevention programs are fantastic. Like Newton Medical Center had a program and has a program called Altitude, which is aimed at preventing, and it has an element which helps children to release emotional pain.
If someone in the audience wants to reach out to you, Ginnie's house is in Newton, they can reach out to them. Where is your practice located?
Oh, my practice is in Sparta, New Jersey.
Sparta, okay. So they would look up psychologist Alexandra Miller.
Alexandra Miller, Live Well Psychology Center.
Live Well Psychology Center.
Thank you. I did not expect a plug.
Of course.
I'm here
of course.
for Ginnie's house. Yeah.
Well, Ginnie's house and you. I appreciate it. And you wrote a book. What's your book, title of your book, and what's it about real quick?
I wrote a children's book. It's called There's Always Hope. And it's based on a true story. And it's about a girl that gets into an accident and is a paraplegic and feels like, what am I going to do now? And it teaches how there is so much that we can do when life gives us unexpected circumstances.
You have to break out of that victim thought process.
Well, there's always something we can do.
Right.
Like what can I do now? What adventure can I have now?
Yep.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for being here.
It's a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. That was episode 2 of Breaking the Silence. These people are on the front lines of getting children to open up. There was, looking back, I have regrets about not speaking up. My father's deceased. Had he been alive and been here to listen to this, I'm sure he would acknowledge that he wished he could have gone about things differently. I hope you picked up on things tonight from Kristi and from Alexandra. Next week, we are going to delve into substance abuse amongst children and teens. I'm going to have on 2 people who are in the substance abuse field. We're going to hear from them how they treat children. And again, I thank you all for tuning in. If this does not directly relate to you, to your family, it may relate to people who are Facebook friends of yours. I would ask you all to share this video because you don't know who it could impact. We had great numbers on the first episode. Let's keep those going. Let's help people change lives. Please share, and let's do our part to bring awareness. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Thanks, Clark.
Back to Bob.
I have to tell you, the biggest thing that I took from our 2 guests, who were phenomenal, is that I just can't get over how the numbers that Ginnie's house tracks during the pandemic have just stopped. I mean, that says just, I can't even describe it. I mean, if people need to listen, people need to know, and people need to break the silence.
Right.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Yep.
And I'd like to thank Kiwanis Club of Clifton, New Jersey. Once again, the pandemic has hit everybody. If you do have the opportunity, if you have the wherewithal to make a donation, you can go to cliftonkiwanis.org, clarkfredericks.com, or www.greatergoodmediallc.com. We naturally will have the show up on our YouTube channel at Greater Good Media LLC, and it was a pleasure having you with us tonight. Tune in next week for the 3rd part of our series, Breaking the Silence. Good night, everyone.